Okay, so welcome to video number 2. We left off with talking about analogous structures, and now we're going to be talking about embryonic development, another example of homology. Okay, so embryonic development is actually one of my favorite ones. I love being able to look and compare embryos of different species, and that's pretty much what this is. So embryonic development is looking at the development of embryos between different species and seeing what they have in common. Even if those two species seem very distantly related, what we have found is that there's actually a lot of similarities that we share when we're still an embryo before we're even born. So for example, the fact that humans, when you're a very tiny embryo, before you become a fetus, we actually have gills at one point. We have a tail. We lose a lot of these things as we develop, so before we're born, but the fact that we had them at one point, even if it was just for a few days, is another piece of evidence that maybe we did have a relatively recent common ancestor with other animals that also share those same similarities. Okay, so in this picture, we're looking at an embryo of a chick and also of a human. So obviously two very different animals, but look at some of the things they have in common. You can look at overall shape, that curvedness over here. We have it over here in humans too. Pharyngeal pouches. So these are pouches that will eventually develop into the structures that will form parts of the ear, the tongue, glands. And so at one point, humans and chicks develop these same identical pouches. Post-anal tail, so we know that chickens do have very tiny tails. They're covered with the feathers, so you don't really see them too much. Humans at one point do have a tail. We lose it, but we still have a tailbone. But my favorite picture when talking about this topic, though, is actually this one. It's just really cool because, so how you read it is we're looking at 1, 2, if you follow the mouse, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 organisms, and then you look at each one vertically. So for example, this one, a fish. So you start off with, this is what a fish looks like in the very beginning stages of embryonic development, and then as it grows a little bit more, it gets to kind of this middle stage, and then it grows even more. This is kind of what a fish will look like before it hatches. Same thing with a salamander. I have to tell you, I really have no idea. It's obviously a turtle of some sort, but I can't read this word. It kind of looks like bonobo, which is not true because a bonobo is a primate. But I don't know what species of turtle this is. But either way, this is a reptile. Here we have a chick, a hog, a cat, a rabbit, and a human. And you know, if you look at the bottom row, the late stages of development for all 8 of these organisms, you can kind of see you can see very clear distinguishing factors. This clearly looks more like a fish, and this one definitely looks more like a turtle. These 4 all look like mammals, right? You have your pig, cat, rabbit, human, a little bit different, but you could see a lot in common. But look at the beginning stages of development. If I rearrange these, you guys or myself I could probably never pick out which one was which animal because they look too much the same. And so even though we all grow differently as we develop as embryos and we acquire different characteristics and different traits and different shapes, at one point we all look almost exactly the same. And this was a really groundbreaking piece of evidence when we first were able to look and analyze embryos, because it shows that at one point we may lose, eventually we don't look like this anymore, but at one point us and fish and salamanders and chickens and a whole range of animals that are not even listed in this picture, we all look the same in the very beginning. And that's a solid piece of evidence for the fact that maybe we had a common ancestor that we inherited this basic similarity of. And then over time, you know, because time has gone by, we've learned to evolve differently, so we develop in different ways. But at one point, we have all these similarities. Very strong piece of evidence for us having a common ancestor. All right, so that's embryonic development as an example of homology. Now we're going to move into molecular biology. Molecular biology is still an example of homology because we're comparing the molecules or the parts of molecules between species. Sometimes it's also known as its own category, which is how I listed it over here. But molecular biology has to do with comparing DNA sequences, so nucleotides, and also comparing proteins. And remember, the building blocks of proteins are amino acids, so comparing the amino acid sequences into making different proteins. What's really interesting is that humans and monkeys and chickens and lampreys, for example, those are a type of very simple fish. We obviously are very different organisms, but when you look at the proteins we make, when you look at our DNA structure, there is so much molecularly that we have the same. We make the same types of proteins. The sequences might differ a little bit, but the fact that we do so many things in common is another solid piece of evidence for having a common ancestor, for descent over time with modification. This picture over here is actually looking at the relationship between vertebrates. Vertebrates, remember, are organisms that have a backbone. Humans, monkeys, mice, chicken, frogs, lampreys. And looking at the differences in the number of amino acids for a particular protein called hemoglobin. So you guys probably remember, hopefully remember, that hemoglobin is a protein. It's carried in your blood. It carries oxygen to your body. And what this chart is showing is how many amino acids differ between the hemoglobin produced by these species to humans. So obviously, if you compare a human hemoglobin to a human hemoglobin, there's going to be no difference because they're the same thing. But if you take a rhesus monkey's hemoglobin and you look at its amino acid sequence, what we find is that there's 8 differences in amino acids between the hemoglobin of rhesus monkeys and the hemoglobin of humans. Just a side note, remember a rhesus monkey were the monkeys that were used in Outbreak, or the ones they were using to test for the antibodies and the antidotes. And then if you look at a mouse, now we have 27 differences of amino acids between the hemoglobin of a mouse and a human. And as you go down the list, look at the trend. You have more and more differences as you get lower. But also look at the species as you get lower. Notice that the more differences they have, the less alike they look to humans, right? So obviously we have a lot more in common with a monkey than we do a mouse. Remember, monkeys are still primates. They have that opposable thumb. Mice are mammals too, but they're not primates. But we're closer to a mouse than we are a chicken. We're closer to a chicken than we are to a frog. And the farthest out of all of these in terms of our similarities is definitely with the fish, the lamprey. Another example that kind of supports this idea of molecular evidence is a protein called cytochrome C. Cytochrome C is a protein. It's found in cells in any organism that does aerobic cellular respiration. So think glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. In order to carry out those reactions, cytochrome C is needed. And remember, it's a protein, so it's a polypeptide. And you might have differences in the amino acid sequences too between the cytochrome Cs of different species, but the fact that we all have a cytochrome C and use that to do aerobic respiration, well, maybe we inherited the code, the instructions for making that protein from a common ancestor. So molecular biology is probably the most recent piece of evidence that we've had over the years since Darwin, but definitely confirmed a lot of observations and inferences that we've made. Okay, and the last one is biogeography. So biogeography, if you break apart the word, so bio, remember, is living, and geography is the space, it's the distribution of living things across the world. So if you look at this bottom picture over here, this is what we think of when we think of the world. This is what our world looks like today. But the continents have not always been in this spot. As you guys know, continents move, and that's because underneath continents are tectonic plates. Okay, so over millions and millions of years, our continents have moved across the world. And I know the famous one that almost everyone knows about is Pangea. This is 250 million years ago, when all the continents, and see if you could pick out which continent is which. So here we have Africa, here we have South America. Look how South America kind of fits into Africa. Let's see, here we have, this must be Europe and Asia, and then maybe, I don't know, maybe North America is down here. But either way, so biogeography is the geographic distribution of a species. So if you might have noticed, and definitely Darwin noticed this and Wallace noticed this when they traveled across the world, is that you may see animals in different parts of the world that kind of look the same but have a few differences. I mean, think, llamas in South America and camels in the Middle East. Same family, the camelid family, but two very different parts of the world. What biogeography does is it kind of explains, okay, well, maybe they're not close together now. Maybe they're on very different continents, but maybe at one point those continents were close together and there was land passage between two different continents where today there is no passage between them. All right, so studying how the world looked over millions of years and the change that happened, it explains to us why certain animals and plants might live in certain areas today. Okay, and then continental drift is the explanation for how this happens. It's a slow movement of tectonic plates. It helps to move around the continents. It explains Pangea. We're going to be looking at some examples now of organisms that are found in different parts of the planet. Before we do that though, endemic species, I forgot about this bullet. Endemic species are species that are only found in one particular location. So for example, humans are not endemic species, they're found everywhere. Mosquitoes are found everywhere, they're not endemic species. But lemurs, so if you look over here off the coast of Africa, you have Madagascar. Madagascar actually has a lot of endemic species. Lemurs are one of them. They also have Madagascar hissing cockroaches. That's another. The Galapagos, another reason why it's such a great and popular place for evolutionary biologists to study is because there's a lot of endemic species there. So species that are found nowhere else in the world except for that one area. What I wanted to show you next is specifically island biogeography. So if you want to see, so one of the things that Darwin noticed and Wallace too is that when they went from, or when Darwin went from island to island, he noticed, okay, we'll have a lot of finches, but they're all different from island to island. How does that happen? Look at this top picture over here. One island could be one landmass over time, and you have one species there. Then maybe some time goes by and the plates move and the land breaks apart, and you end up having two islands. Well, over time, species A, this species A, and this species A, they're not going to interact with each other anymore because there's too much of a space between them. And so over time, maybe one of them will start to change a little bit, maybe different environment. And over time, it might evolve into a new species, which we'll call species B. But then maybe say more time goes on and species B now the land that species B is on will now break again. You have three islands. Well, this species B and this species B are not going to interact anymore. So maybe over time that, inability to interact causes them to change. They are now living in different environments. B might evolve into a new species we call species C. And we kind of show this as cladograms over here. So they're charts that show relationships between species. So B and C are the most similar. They're still connected in the same line. Okay, because they kind of separated the most recent. But then they're equally related to species A. And then if you keep going, you might have a mountain form over millions of years. That mountain will create a barrier between the organisms that are species C, and it'll now form the original species C, but now the same species C will evolve into species D. And so when you have two species or a group of species that don't interact with each other for a very long period of time, they might grow to be so different that they won't reproduce with each other anymore because they don't recognize each other. And that's what will become the new formation of a species. Okay, but these charts called cladograms, we will cover this when we come back from March break. That will be in our classification chapter. The last example, though, that I just wanted to show you, before, remember when you saw South America kind of fitting into kind of perfectly into Africa? Well, there's a fossil of a reptile called Mesosaurus, and these fossils are only found in this eastern part of South America and southwestern part of Africa. But if you think back to when South America was actually fitting into Africa, these land masses were actually touching and were together. And then when the continent separated, well, some of these animals stayed on this land continent and some stayed over here. But this is the reason for why you have very similar fossils on two very different continents. Nowadays we would know they would never swim across, each other. But at one point they didn't need to because the land was together. And then this is our last slide. I mentioned this before, the camelid family, those are the camels. So at one point, a little bit after Pangea, where our continents were kind of arranged like this, so you can kind of see which continents is which. Here you have Asia and Europe. Here you have North America, you have South America, but the migration of the camelid family had a much more easier route this way. And so you have some camelids going into the Middle East and in Asia. Those are what we think of as our camels. And then some descendants of the camelids actually migrated all the way down to South America, which we know now as the llamas in the Andes. All right, so biogeography does kind of explain a lot of the questions we have as to why certain distributions of animals are here. When we come into class tomorrow, hopefully we'll have school tomorrow, you'll have a chance to kind of sit down, ask any questions on these pieces of evidence. We'll talk a little bit about evidence and see one more example, and then we're going to move on to the evolution of populations, which is our next evolution chapter. Okay, so make sure these notes are written down. I'm going to check them tomorrow, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.